Today we're going to be making a hanging terrarium out of a small glass container and a modded clamp-on light. So without delay, we're going to start with the soil mix. This is the most important part of any terrarium because at the end of the day, this is where your plants are going to be living in. So for this mix, I'm going to be using black lava rock, sphagnum moss, peat moss, but I would actually recommend coco coir over peat moss personally. This is just what I had on hand, and earthworm castings. This mix is referencing one that Worcester Terrariums had. I'll have a link in the video down below, but I'm eyeballing the measurements, but it looked like about equal parts, so I'm just going with that. It seemed to make a pretty good mix. You can see it's light and fluffy, but it also holds moisture. You can see how it crumbles apart like that. That's pretty good. So now that we have the soil mix done, we're on to starting the drainage layer, which is an incredibly important part of a terrarium. The main function of this is if you were to overwater your terrarium, for example, the water, instead of sitting in your soil and rotting your roots, it would fall down into this layer where it's allowed to be separate from your roots and evaporate back out into your terrarium or out of the container. The next part is optional, but I like to add this fiberglass screen in between the drainage and the soil layer. This helps keep the two separate. Over time, you can have the soil slowly seep into this drainage layer, and then that can cause long-term problems, so this helps prevent that. And as far as how I'm cutting it to shape, I'm pretty much just eyeballing it because it's a weird container shape. There's no clear lines to go off of, and I got this container at Goodwill for $7, so that was kind of a steal. Anyway, once I had it cut to shape, it fit roughly in place. I put the soil in, and I had it sloped from front to back. You can see as I turn it here, that slope is to add depth, and since it'll be hanging, it'll let shorter people actually see the terrarium. Anyway, moving on to planting, I'm going to be putting the plant names on the screen here. Some of these are pretty standard plants, but others like this peacock moss or the ruby red club moss are a little bit harder to find. However, most of these should be pretty straightforward to find. Now, the next step, I'm just prepping all of these plants by taking them out of the pots and working on the soil to get a lot of that old soil out, and taking small cuttings from each of the plants and putting them to the side. I had a ton of plants left over after this. I used maybe a third, maybe a half of the plants for some of them, so I had a ton left over that I can actually use for other projects. Alright, now let's move on to the hardscape. I only used one piece of black lava rock for this, so it's a pretty simple scape. I put it off to the side and angled it a little bit for a semi-triangular layout. Now with a small container like this, I feel like less is more with the hardscape, so I kept it simple. Now it's time for the fun part, planting. Now I started with the micans here because I felt like it was important to get this out of the way, get the big roots in first. This was definitely the biggest of all of the root systems that I had to work with, and I had to actually trim it down a little bit further here. You can see I'm removing some leaves. These leaves would have covered the rest of the plants and blocked a lot of the hardscape. I feel like it would have distracted from a lot of it, so I took most of these leaves off. Then I filled in the back with these autumn ferns. They're going to get a little bit bigger than the rest of the plants, so I figured they would go best in the back. And then I just continued planting the rest of what I had on hand. So the Selaginella or the ruby red club moss, I was going to keep roughly towards the middle. The Pilea glauca is also going to be in that space around the middle of the terrarium, and the mood moss towards the front, and later on you'll also see I add the mood moss in back. And the peacock moss I also just kind of scatter around in between some of the other plants. Once the planting was pretty much done, you'll see later on I do a little more. Just give it a good spray down, and the terrarium was pretty much done, or at least I was done with it for the day. Now, this doesn't have a light yet. This is the light we're going to be modding. It's a clamp LED from Amazon. I'll put a link down below. And we're going to be starting this mod with some wire strippers, wire cutters, needle nose pliers, and a heat gun. And step 1 will be to take this clamp off. So I just have to take this nut off and then cut the wire in half. I actually cut out a lot of the footage here, but I had some trouble taking this off. It was over tightened. And once I got this nut off, then the clamp came off, but it wouldn't come off entirely because I need to cut the wire in half. Some other things were blocking it, but it was at a point where I could do a test fit. So I cut the wire. Now this clamp can finally slide off, and I started to strip down the wires so that I can start soldering an extension to it. That extension is what's going to hide the wire in the final product. I didn't want to drill through walls or anything. I live in an apartment. I can't really do a lot of mods to my actual living space, but I can do mods to my lights. And this is what it looks like. It's ready to solder together. So now we have the extension cable, which is white, that's going to hide against the white wall, and that's going to connect to the actual power cable that is originally powering the light. Now, for soldering, I do recommend opening a window, having some airflow, because the fumes from this are not good for you. And the workspace that I'm doing this on is not ideal either. But again, I live in an apartment, so I make do, and this is what we end up with. One other thing to note is, I didn't do it here, but I would personally shrink wrap each individual wire so you don't get crossed wires or shorts, but I didn't have any problems with it. Here's what the mod looks like in the end. Pretty good, but a little jank. You'll see once it gets up, it looks really nice. The next step is going to be cable management, so I'm just going to zip tie the light to the chain here, and afterwards I use these little, I don't know what they're called, they're little cable mounts, and hammering it into the corner so it hides the white cable. And you can see it's white on white, so the cable is pretty well hidden in plain sight. Now we're nearly done with this terrarium. The only thing left to do is to do some minor touch-ups and add the inhabitants. I added some more water before moving on to adding some dwarf white isopods very carefully into the terrarium. And then I added some springtails. Now, at this point, the terrarium is still a little bit barren in my opinion. There's some bald spots on the soil, so I filled those in with some additional mood moss in the front and the back before calling this terrarium completely finished. If you like this video or what I'm doing on this page, you know what to do. And if you're interested in this paludarium, I have a build video on it as my first video on the channel, so I'll have a link down below for that as well. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.